Benvenuti a questo incontro. Sono molto felice che sia arrivato proprio in questo momento Thierry Frémaux, che ha presentato a Cannes la versione restaurata di Per un pugno di dollari, e nell'introduzione, era la serata conclusiva del Festival di Cannes, ha detto: sono molto felice che questo film sia nella selezione ufficiale del festival, perché all'epoca sicuramente non avrebbe potuto esserlo. Qui in Italia ancora oggi forse credo non si è veramente capito la grandezza di Sergio Leone e quanto quel film sia stato un incredibile momento di cambiamento e di innovazione nella storia del cinema. È per questo che sono molto felice che abbia accettato di venire qui al Cinema Ritrovato Christopher Frayling, che è un grande studioso della cultura popolare, ma per noi italiani è soprattutto quello che meglio di chiunque altro ha saputo raccontare con intelligenza e con profondità la grande qualità, la grande capacità innovatrice di Sergio Leone e più in generale dell'età degli western spaghetti. Ma prima di Christopher Frayling invito sul palco Davide Pozzi, che ha restaurato Per un pugno di dollari e che compie, credo, il desiderio di tutti gli spettatori del Cinema Ritrovato, poter vedere le differenze tra il materiale originale in 35 mm, la copia che ci è stata data dal produttore, dalla figlia del produttore, quindi era veramente una copia importante in qualche modo d'epoca, e il restauro digitale, poter vedere con i nostri occhi nello stesso tempo le differenze tra il 35 mm e il DCP. Almeno ci proviamo. Davide Pozzi.
Good morning. I'm going to talk with my bad English, but maybe it's more direct. So, before to give the microphone to Christopher, we try a live performance. We try, okay? Be prepared. Yesterday we did a technical rehearsal, was perfect. So I'm afraid today it won't be, okay? But before to start, I would like to show you something. Yesterday, during the talk with Sean, Ned, and Grover, we talked a lot about analog versus digital, and Grover pointed out that one of the most delicate things is the grading, and I perfectly agree. If you want, one of my nightmares when I restore film is to respect as much as possible the original look of the film, because today with the digital tools we can do everything, too much, and the main goal of a restorer is to respect the film. And I have two nightmares: the color look and the sound as well. Regarding the color, every time we do a restoration, we do a lot of research in order to find a vintage print that we can use as a reference. Of course, we check if people that work on the film are alive and they can work with us, but as well we try to locate as much as possible the vintage print, because we need to look how the film was, even if the copy is very damaged today, even if the copy is faded. But we need to have an idea. We need to understand the spirit of the print. And talking about Fistful of Dollars, that was made 50 years ago, we were lucky, because for the restoration we had the original camera negative that physically was in a good shape. There was some little chemical problem that we were able to fix scanning Wetgate, and I remember you that the original camera negative of Fistful of Dollars was a Techniscope. That means is a 2 perforation film instead of 4 perforation, okay? And we were able to locate this print. This print is a very special print because the film stock was an Eastman color, but during the 60s the copy were printed using the Technicolor system, okay? Technicolor is a different system, and you can recognize a vintage Technicolor print looking at the optical soundtrack, because the Technicolor film stock is black and white, okay? And here, your soundtrack is black and white. When you have a color print with a black and white soundtrack, you are in your hands, and you are lucky, my dear, a Technicolor vintage print. And there's another very important aspect, that this print has two kinds of sound. We have the optical, but as well we have 1, 2, 3, and 4 magnetic tracks. Okay? And it's a Technicolor print. So we were able to use this print as a reference for our color grading. Be aware that the printer is a little bit faded and is a Technicolor. So some red is missing today. Okay? That's the reason. Keep in mind. Now we can try to start. Okay, I have to make phone call in the cabin, okay? And I need the microphone. Okay, we start particle number 35, sì. Is the last reel, the reel number 5. Now we go with the vintage print, 35 mm. Will be a silent screening. Okay, it's quite normal because it's the beginning. Now make comfortable your eyes. You can see that it's a different color look compared to today. It's warmer, but all the western are always a little bit yellowish and has a warmer color correction. Keep as well, I need a turn end. Keep as well in mind the grain, okay, because it's a two-perf, and then we have to compare the color correction, but as well how we try to respect the grain. Very soon we start to switch. Okay. Okay, switch. Now we switch. Hop. There's. Okay, now we are on the DCP. Okay? Ok, switchiamo. 3, 2, 1, copy. You can see that they are very, very close. Switcher. Now we go to the DCP. 1, 0. Hop, DCP. And as well, please try to appreciate, I hope, the respect of the grain. Switch, Elena. 3, 2, 1. Vintage print. A little bit reddish because it's a little bit faded. Okay? Switch pure. Now we go back to DCP. 1, 0, go. DCP. And look at the respect of the grain as well, because it's very, very important for us. Switch. Copy. You see, I think, and I hope you agree with me, that we can say the spirit of the print, the look of the film, switcher, is very, very close. We respect it. switchiamo ancora. Again, we go back to the vintage print. Hop, the print. Ancora. We go to the DCP now. DCP. Switchiamo. We go to the print. Print. DCP, poi chiudiamo. Sì. Hop. Aspetta, magari facciamo un altro. Yeah. Vai. Again, we go back to the film. Hop. Ok. Grazie, possiamo fermarci. Ok. A big thank you in the projector room because it was not easy. They were perfect. Oh, it worked. Okay, that's in fact was the goal of my talk. Try to explain how we do our best. In fact, to respect the original look, because as they said yesterday, restoration are made not by machine but by people. People must be thinking, must be checking, must be making a lot of research. There's no restoration only with techniques. We need our experience, we need to search and to look at everything, because it's not easy to find a good vintage print. But when you have, I think, a very good reference. And that's it. And now I thank you so much. Hopefully you enjoyed it.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for inviting me to Bologna to talk about Sergio Leone. I think we're making history today because, as they did at the Cannes Film Festival, by treating Sergio Leone as a major filmmaker within the film of authors, the film of directors, rather than in the world of spaghetti western, etc. And I think it's only taken 50 years for the world to catch up with this idea, but it was 50 years well spent. Because this year is the 50th anniversary of Per un pugno di dollari, which came out in September 1964 in Florence, and then in October at the Super Cinema in Rome. I want to start with a quotation from the great Italian novelist Alberto Moravia, who wrote a review in L'Espresso in January 1967 of Il buono, il brutto, il cattivo. And by the way, I'd like to dedicate this morning's talk to Eli Wallach, who died last week. I'd like to say, ciao il brutto. He once said to me that he would very much like written on his gravestone, here lies the ugly. So maybe they'll do that. So my quotation from Moravia, I'll take this slowly so that it can be translated back into Italian. I've translated it into English. There's no West in Italy. There are no cowboys and bandits on the frontier. There's no frontier, for that matter. No gold mines or Indians or pioneers. The Italian Western was born not from myth and ancestral memory, but from the instinct of filmmakers who, when they were young, were head over heels in love with the Hollywood Western. In other words, the Hollywood Western was born from a myth. The Italian one was born from a myth about a myth. The main characters are everyday delinquents who are in the background of American films, but in the Italian ones have invaded the foreground and become the protagonists. The qualities which make them attractive are not chivalry and generosity, but street wisdom and guile and ingenuity. This contrasts radically with the grand settings of the Western. So you find yourself asking this question: after all these stories, then what? Is it just a fistful of dollars, or is there more? Now, I've spent the last 40 years trying to persuade everyone that there is a lot more going on in these films than just a myth about a myth. Yes, you could place Leone's films within a cinematic movement of the 1960s. Chabrol with Hitchcock, Godard with Republic Studios, Jean-Pierre Melville with the French gangster film, the American gangster film, and Sergio Leone and the films of John Ford. I mean, there's a movement going on of a kind of critical cinema where European filmmakers take Hollywood films and remake them in different ways. And you could place Leone in that context. He didn't like it, but you could. What I want to do in this talk is to really place Leone in an Italian context, because I think these films are much more interesting if viewed not as ersatz American films, but as Italian films. And if you treat Leone as an Italian filmmaker rather than a sort of crypto-Hollywood filmmaker. So I want to explore, but just before I do, another quotation, if I might, from Sergio himself, because I think this is the root of what he was doing. He was born in 1929 in Trastevere, and he grew up in the 1930s. He was about the same age as Ennio Morricone. They were almost the same age. Morricone in 1928, Leone in 1929. Grew up in Trastevere in the 1930s, joined the film industry in 1947, where he appeared briefly in The Bicycle Thieves by De Sica, where he plays a rather improbable priest with glasses and rather overweight, but he's a priest. And he also appeared in La Traviata, an early opera film. But he wrote this, he said this rather: "In my childhood, America was like a religion. Throughout my childhood and adolescence, I dreamed of the wide open spaces of America, the great expanses of desert, the extraordinary melting pot, the first nation made up of people from all over the world, the long straight roads which begin nowhere and end nowhere, because their function is simply to cross the whole continent. And then in 1943 to 4, when I was 14, real-life Americans abruptly entered my life in jeeps, and they upset all my dreams. They'd come to liberate me, but I found them very energetic, but very, very deceptive. They were no longer the Americans of the West. They were soldiers like any others, with the big difference that they were victorious soldiers. Men who were materialist, possessive, keen on pleasures and earthly goods. In the GIs who chased after our women and sold their cigarettes on the black market, I could see nothing of what I had seen on the screen and in Hemingway, Dos Passos and Raymond Chandler. And I think the root, if you want to find a root of Sergio Leone's cinema, it's a love and understanding of Hollywood films combined with a complete rejection of what they stood for, with their ideology. So you've got someone who absolutely knew his films. I mean, I did an interview with him once, and he talked me through The Magnificent Seven. And he didn't understand English. But he described every shot, you know, medium shot, long shot of Yul Brynner, close-up of boots. Amazing. I mean, he knew these things as if they were part of the liturgy. So he understood the grammar of Hollywood and the way Hollywood films were made, but he rejected, from all sorts of points of view, what they stood for. And I think if you want, what he always said was that his plan, he wanted to get back to the magic that he experienced as a child in Trastevere when he went to those films, but the magic would be created in different ways, no longer in a sentimental, old-fashioned way, but he called them fairy tales for grown-up people. fairy tales for grown-up people. So I'm just going to take you through some thoughts about Leone and Italy. The three films for which he's best known, of course, happened very quickly. 64, autumn, Fistful of Dollars. 65, autumn, for a few dollars more. 66, autumn, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which actually translates as The Good, the Ugly, and the Bad. But it doesn't sound quite so good in English, so The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Leone, if you look at the top row, the second one in is Leone S, and then you look at the person next to him, and the one next to him is Morricone E. They were both at school together at the Terza Elementare, just before primary school, and so they'd known each other for a very, very long time. They grew up together at the same school and then went their separate ways. Morricone is misspelt, which is rather sweet, with one R. Leone's formation is an important part of the story. Mario Camerini, the filmmaker, was his godfather, and his father had been a director of silent films under the name of Roberto Roberti. His name is Vincenzo Leone. His mother was a star of silent cinema, who went under the pseudonym of Bice Valerian, and she retired from the cinema when Sergio was born in 1929. Roberto Roberti continued making films in the sound era, but fell out with the Mussolini regime and only came back in 1938, 1939. So he grew up in the crucible of the cinema. Mario Camerini is his godfather. Carmine Gallone, he made a lot of films for in the 50s. Mario Bonnard. So one side of Leone's formation is popular Italian cinema of the 1950s. The other side of his formation is all these Hollywood movies that moved to Rome in the 1950s to use up frozen dollars, you know, what Fellini called Hollywood on the Tiber. He was the first assistant in the second unit that filmed the chariot race in Ben-Hur, next to Andrew Martin. Somewhere in this picture is Sergio Leone. He worked on Quo Vadis, Helen of Troy, The Nun's Story, Sodom and Gomorrah, all sorts of very expensive films made based in Rome in the 1950s. So he understood how to make action sequences, Hollywood style. If you were cynical, you might say he wasn't quite so good at dialogue because he was always in the second unit, which filmed the horses. But I think that's unfair. Okay. His first major film as a director was called The Colossus of Rhodes, which was an Italian version of one of these epics. Filmed in Spain, in Laredo. It wasn't an expensive film. In fact, you could call it The Foot of Rhodes, because they could afford the foot and they couldn't afford much else. There was lots of model work, and they turned the Colossus into a political prison, and with Rory Calhoun, looking rather muddled actually, as a Greek freedom fighter in Rhodes. But it was a popular film, and it made his name. Leone never spoke English, except one phrase in the early days: watch me. Watch me, Rory. So what he would do is he'd act out the part, and in the process, I believe, he turned every character into a Roman character. Because Leone couldn't help acting out these parts as if they were Roman villains, Roman heroes, and all the rest of it. So watch me, Rory. And he wasn't acting American style, he was acting Roman style. Watch me, Clint. Watch me, Lee. Watch me, Eli. Anyway. Now, some people thought that Leone invented the concept of an Italian Western, but of course, the first spaghetti Western was Puccini's Girl of the Golden West, 1912, where he used, which premiered in New York, based on a play by David Belasco, and it used various folk themes from American music and turned them into a grand opera. And indeed, Leone's mother appeared in a film now lost. If ever, any of you who are in archives, if you can find a film called Vampira Indiana, made in 1912, please let us know, because it may be one of the first Italian Westerns, and Sergio Leone's mum plays an Indian princess. One still has survived. But anyway, there were lots of Italian, and comic strips, you know, Tex starts in 1947 as a comic strip in Italy. So there's a big tradition of interest in the Western. What was new was the Italianization of the Western, I think, in Leone's hands. But it isn't really Italianization. The story starts when, in the Arlecchino cinema in Rome, in the autumn of 1963, Leone goes to see Kurosawa's film, Yoshimbo. And immediately he thinks this would make a terrific Western. Instead of a samurai warrior, a man with no name. Instead of the Baxters and the Rojos, the two factions in Fistful of Dollars, the silk merchants and the sake merchants. And the samurai sits at the top of the bell tower, makes one faction fight another, and watches the mayhem and enjoys himself hugely. And Leone thought this would be interesting. It was a time of depression in the Italian film industry. There'd been two financial disasters, the Leopard and Cleopatra. And the American companies were beginning to pull out of Rome. Indeed, their agencies were beginning to pull out. So it was a time of crisis. It needed a shot in the arm to get it going again. If you look at the Italian poster of A Fistful of Dollars, I don't know if anyone, the Japanese poster, if anyone reads Japanese, the title is The Return of Yoshimbo. So they didn't make any pretense about it in Italy. In Japan, it's The Return of Yoshimbo. Basically, someone forgot to clear the rights. No one's quite sure who. Leone said it was the producers said it was Leone, etc. So there's much discussion. But the result of it was that Kurosawa was awarded in a court case the rights to A Fistful of Dollars in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. He also got 15% of the profits of the movie, which infuriated Leone because it was his 15%. He didn't make much money out of this film. And it's interesting, it sowed the seeds of the cult of what's known as the macaroni western in Japan with the success of A Fistful of Dollars. There's a wonderful story that I heard, that the letter that arrived from Kurosawa when the film Pen and Pugno was finished, a letter arrived, I really enjoyed your film, but it is my film. And I am a signatory of the Berne Convention on Copyright, you owe me money. And Leone read this letter and went round saying, I've had a letter from Kurosawa, it's fantastic. And they said, yeah, but have you read it? He was very, very excited. Most American Westerns base their visuals on the late 19th century paintings of Frederick Remington and Charles B. Russell, the classic American illustrator painters. John Ford's films could almost be, I've put a clapperboard on top of a Remington painting as if it's John Ford going filming. Leone's references are very, very different. The first is the tradition of Italian puppetry. He always said that he felt when making his westerns like a puppeteer of the Pupi Siciliani, where you take a traditional story, in the case of the Pupi Siciliani, the Song of Roland, Orlando Furioso, a medieval legend of the battle on the bridge against the Moors, and the chivalric knights, Rolando, against the baddies. And the puppeteers adapt the story to the location that they're visiting. So they find out who's the bad guy locally. Oh, it's the chemist. So the bad guy in the puppets becomes the chemist, or the good guy becomes the mayor. They adjust the story to fit local traditions. And Leone's, that's exactly what I did with the Western. I took the old stories and adapted them to the location of Italy, so that culturally they made sense in Italy. And I felt like a puppeteer. He also directed one thing that the outtakes, which at the very end as a treat, I'm going to show you one or two of the outtakes which have just surfaced for A Fistful of Dollars. He's moving his actors around like puppets. Stand there and scowl. Just stand there. And it isn't really directing performance, it's moving puppets around the theatre stage. Definitely that's how he directed to start with. So one tradition is the Pupi Siciliani. That's maybe where the poncho came from. Yeah. These are versions of also Arlecchino. The other puppet tradition that Leone remembered is the burattini, which is glove puppets from Naples rather than...
Oh no.
Have I done something? Rather than... Oh dear. Anyway, can you hear me without? I'll keep going. Yeah. the Burattini from Naples, Leone remembered going to a puppet show in Rome and seeing, absolutely captivated by these glove puppets. And then he walked behind the puppet theatre and saw this husband and wife team who were producing the puppets having a terrible row. And so it was all a love story on the stage, but behind the scene with these people shouting at each other and throwing the crockery, he said, at last I understood what art is. So the puppets are important. We need the pictures, actually. Okay. Oh yeah, no, I need the next one.
Pare che sia tornato, però non c'è.
All right, okay, it's not me. So that's one aspect of it culturally. Leone was himself a great collector of paintings and antiques, as his father had been before him. But his father had to sell the collection in order to make ends meet during difficult times in the 1930s. And he had this kind of obsession with developing a collection on the scale of his father. So if you visited Leone's house, there's a De Chirico, there's Magritte, in fact 2 De Chiricos, Magritte and various other paintings. And I think one thing that he wanted to put into his films was an enormous amount of surface detail of objects and things and guns and a sort of material culture that he loved objects, he loved antiques, and that's a very strong aspect of it. And part of the way to make the fairy tale believable was to have a lot of detail to throw at the audience, so that it's not like a Disney film where everything is artificial. It looks real. The surface is very real. Stubble, you know, faces which have wounds and pockmarks, and antiques and so on. And that's one of the strategies you use to make people believe in the fairy tale. In fact, when he was filming Il Buono, Brutto, Cattivo, he handed Tonino Dellicoli, the director of photography, some postcards of De Chirico and said, that's what I want it to look like. The midday sun, the American train in the background, the sort of colonnades, and everything throwing long shadows in the midday sun, like those De Chirico paintings of Ariadne. You may know them. Leone owned one of them. And so that was the look. And if you remember in Il Buono, Brutto, Cattivo, when Eli Wallach is in the desert and he puts up a pink parasol, you know, he's on a horse, and for some reason suddenly a pink umbrella appears. It's just like a De Chirico painting. You know? Surrealism rides the range, another Italian tradition. We do need the pictures, ladies and gentlemen, are we? How are we?
It's a blackout.
It's a blackout.
Yeah.
How long do they last normally? I've got to keep going.
Yeah.
Okay. Wait a minute. I'm going to read you another quote. Yeah. Let me. Yeah. Here we go. Now, I'm not claiming that Leone was a great intellectual. He wasn't much of a reader. In fact, his brother-in-law, Fulvio Morsella, who produced several of his films, would read whole books to him. In fact, the poor man had to read my book on spaghetti westerns, which is 300 pages, and translate it into Italian for him to understand it. But visually, he was very, very intelligent. He had this astonishing visual culture, partly painting, partly antiques, but also cinema. He had an incredible visual sense. And I think the second new tradition that he found coming out of his attitude to Hollywood is taking the visuals of Hollywood films and turning them into a kind of rhetoric, pumping them up, making them bigger than Hollywood ever made them. Take, for example, the way that Hollywood had filmed duels at the end of the Western, the classic thing of two people walking towards each other down the main street. Suddenly, well, in the case of The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, you know, it lasts a whole reel, and instead of in a straight line, it's in a circle. Instead of taking 20 seconds, it takes about 6 minutes, and everyone stares at each other for a very long time, and you get mariachi trumpet on the soundtrack, and there's a kind of rhetoric where everything's pumped up. It's nothing to do with the real world, it's a cinematic reality that you're watching. And it's a film about the way Hollywood used to do it, only he's changed it into this rhetoric. And I think it's a very, Clint Eastwood said to me that Leone's contribution was to opera-size the Western, to turn it into a kind of grand opera. not in the traditional sense, but just the whole experience of music and image. Leone's idea was that sound was at least 40% of the experience of watching a movie. And of course in Italy, where everything was post-synchronized, you could design the soundtrack in a very, very intricate way. Do you remember the opening sequence of Once Upon a Time in the West, where they're sitting at the railway station, where you get the water wheel and the fly and the door banging and the telegraph? It's an incredible piece of sound design, laid on afterwards, completely different to the Hollywood way of laying direct sound. And he reckoned that's another kind of rhetoric. It's a rhetorical use of sound. In fact, Ennio Morricone said that he had in fact composed a piece of music for the opening sequence of C'era una volta il West, but it didn't work. And one night they went, Morricone went to a concert in Florence of avant-garde music by a pupil of John Cage. And the pupil of John Cage he stood on the stage with a microphone and a metal ladder and did Symphony for Metal Ladder for 20 minutes, squeaking on it. And the idea was, any sound is music in the context of an opera house, of a concert hall. And the whole thing is the relationship with the audience. And he phoned up Leone that night and said, why don't we make it a symphony of natural sounds at the beginning of Once Upon a Time in the West? Why don't we simply lay on a water wheel that needs oiling, and a fly that's buzzing, and the telegraph that's going like this, and the water dripping on someone's head, and turn it into a kind of John Cage experiment in sound? I think it's like a piece of performance art, that sequence. And it's, in my view, the best thing that Leone and Morricone ever did. The best music he never wrote. Because it's such a... Cage was himself a pupil of John Cage. Morricone was himself a pupil of John Cage. He went to a seminar in Darmstadt in 1957 under Cage. And all that use of natural sounds in his music, for a fistful of dollars, whip cracks and anvils and bells and people shouting, is a kind of version of the John Cage experiment turned into popular music. So there's a hell of a lot going on in the sound design and in the visual design as well. I need some pictures. Anything happening? Okay, I'll keep going. What else now? Casting. Mark Twain once said that in America you're famous for your latest work, in Europe you're famous for your greatest work. And they have very long memories. Cineasts in Europe have very long memories. So for example, Lee Van Cleef had appeared as the second baddie from the left in countless westerns. He made his debut in High Noon, and he'd been knifed in Gunfight at the OK Corral. He'd been shot in The Bravados. He'd been hanged in this film and so on. He never lasted more than one reel, but he walked in an interesting way, and he had an extremely interesting face. And Leone said, Lee Van Cleef has a face that punches holes in the screen. So he tried to find him in America after the success of Per un pugno di dollari. He had in fact retired from filmmaking and was working as a painter. But eventually he tracked down Lee Van Cleef and made him an offer he couldn't refuse. He actually took a suitcase full of money and said, you know, can we work together? Put him on a plane, and within a fortnight Lee Van Cleef was the star for a few dollars more. Long memory of Lee Van Cleef. He was completely forgotten in America, but long memories. And the casting of these films is, I think, very important. I mean, when you think Clint Eastwood, he was the second lead in a long-running American television series called Rawhide for CBS television. And his contract stipulated that he wasn't allowed to star in films in the United States during the time of the making of Rawhide. So he had to work in Europe if he was going to make any films. He wasn't the first choice. The first choice was Henry Fonda, for The Man with No Name, but his agent didn't even show him the script. The second choice was Charles Bronson, ditto. The third choice was James Coburn, and James Coburn was asking $25,000, which was too much for this very low-budget film. He only had 15. So eventually, as the fourth and possibly fifth choice, because some people say he wanted Cliff Robertson, they approached Cliff Robertson for casting against type, they went with Clint Eastwood. And I once asked Leone, what did he feel when Clint Eastwood arrived at the airport in Rome, and he'd never met him before. He'd seen an episode of Rawhide called Incident of the Black Sheets, and Eastwood arrived in his jeans and his denim shirt. What went through Leone's mind? And Leone said a wonderful thing. He said, "It is said that Michelangelo looked at a block of marble and saw Moses. I looked at Clint Eastwood and saw a block of marble." Which is just what I wanted. So, anyway, it's a great one, I think. I got the feeling he'd said it once or twice before. But the casting is so interesting. And then you get to the third film, where you have Eli Wallach, a completely different sort of actor from the actor's studio. Whereas Eastwood is a professional from Universal Studios who works on television, and Lee Van Cleef is a Hollywood professional who plays bad guys professionally. Eli Wallach, he's a graduate from Lee Strasberg. He's an internal actor who believes in motivation, and he'd written an article in 1964 where he said, "I'm fed up with violence in the cinema, I'm fed up with playing Latino characters, and I'm fed up with standing around on the set. I want to go back to Broadway." So he ends up playing a Latino character in an extremely violent film and coming to Italy. But he had a wonderful, wonderful time, and Leone and Eli Wallach really hit it off, which leads towards Rod Steiger, also Actors Studio in Ci Testa, and of course Robert De Niro in Once Upon a Time in America. So that other style of acting in Leone's mature films becomes more important, where the internal, the emotions matter. You can have a range of emotions and you learn something about the character. They're not just puppets that you move around. Of course, the Americans were contrasted with the Spanish and Italian actors. He deliberately cast theatrical actors to play the Mexicans, who were big performances, too big. So you can contrast the coolness and the stillness of the American character with this explosive performance by Gian Maria Volonte, a lot of shouting and deliberately over the top. And it's that contrast in performance that lies at the heart of the film. You know, it's sort of theatrical, expressive acting versus non-acting, just being, you know. And that works very, very effectively. So the casting. Another aspect of this is the design. Leone was very lucky to meet, when he was preparing Per un pugno di dollari, the architect Carlo Simi. Carlo Simi was a trained architect who'd worked on various films like Helen of Troy and Romulus and Remus, but had never really made his name as a film designer. And he walked into the office at Jolly Film and looked at the drawings that were intended for the film and said, "They're useless. Make them bigger. Let's make them bigger. If you want a house, let's have a huge high ceiling. Let's have a huge front door. Let's make this big. Let's make an impression through the buildings." So Simi and Leone were, I think, as important as Morricone and Leone. As a designer, it's the visual experience of these films is very strong. It's a kind of the American West interpreted by an Italian architect, turning into pure style. I mean, for example, in Once Upon a Time in the West, the main house is so improbable, it's extraordinary. It's made of hundreds of, it's in the middle of the desert where there are no trees, so it's made entirely of logs. And you think, where did those trees come from? Never mind, it looks great. It looks like a chalet. One of the critics called it a fistful of Dolomites. Anyway, it's like a sort of ski chalet. And the reason they had all the logs was that Orson Welles had been making Falstaff, Chimes at Midnight, the battle scene, the Battle of Shrewsbury, and he left behind all these logs. And so the crew arrived in Almeria in southern Spain and found all these logs. Yeah, let's make a house out of logs. And so you've got this astonishing, it's still there. 48 years later, it's still a solid structure. You could visit it in Almeria. This was very, very solidly built. So Simi, I think, is very, very important. And they fired each other up with ideas. The dream was that Morricone would write the music before they started filming. That Leone wanted to turn his films into pure melodrama, like a 2-hour rock video. And there's bits of For a Few Dollars More where the music was written in advance, notably the final scene. And there's quite a lot of The Good, the Bad and the Ugly where the music was written in advance. The whole of the last reel, you know, with Wallach running round and round the graveyard, followed by the duel, was cut to the music. But only with Once Upon a Time in the West was the entire score written and recorded before they started filming. So if you look at pictures of the filming of C'era una volta il West, there's an open reel tape recorder on a trestle table, and they're playing the soundtrack while they act. And it was Leone's way of getting an emotional performance, that he wasn't good, you know, watch me, Claudia, you know, watch me, Charlie. But if you play the music, it said what he wanted to say. And that's a unique form. I think Once Upon a Time in the West is an astonishing mixture of music and image. It's so integrated. There's a scene where Claudia Cardinali arrives at the station and the crane goes up in time with the crescendo of the music and lands just at the right, and then she walks through the station master's office to this new town that's being built, the town of Flagstone. It is extraordinary how integrated the image is with the music. And the horses sometimes trot in time with the, I mean, it's absolutely amazing. And that was the dream, to create a kind of entirely visual oral experience without the need of too much dialogue. So you've got the puppets, you've got the music, you've got the casting, and you've got the architecture, and then you've got the paintings. If you watch A Fistful of Dollars, you'll see that most of the visual references, for example, there's a scene where there's a long table where 12 bad guys are standing there, sitting there having supper, and you immediately think, wow, it's Leonardo's Last Supper, which of course it is. Or there's a scene where Marisol, this family at the center of the action, and just in case you haven't got the idea, they're called Julio, Marisol, and Little Jesus. And Marisol and Little Jesus are constantly standing there as if it's a kind of Madonna and child. And then you've got a riot of Catholic imagery. Bell towers, coffins, cemeteries, adobe churches. And one thing Leone did was shift the Western from the Middle West, which is basically Protestant, to the Southwest, which is basically Catholic. So all his films, the Westerns, were set on the Texas-Mexico border, where there's a Latino-Hispanic influence on the architecture and the religion and everything else. And that was a big shift. So it made Peckinpah possible. You know, the idea of the Wild Bunch crossing the border into Mexico as bounty hunters was entirely made possible by Leone's cinema. He shifts, you know, the cultural iconography of the West is... I'm not saying that these films are Catholic. On the contrary, he satirizes the church mercilessly, but the imagery is taken from that culture. So there's a whole stream of things which lead one to the thought that these are Italian cultural products, Hollywood filtered through Italy. And in the same way that people rate Chabrol films because they're a French take on Hitchcock by someone who loved Hitchcock, and in the same way that Godard, early Godard, is related to the B-movies of Sam Fuller or the Republic Studios, filtered through a French intelligence, I believe that Leone's films are best approached as Italian cultural products which are, have a relationship with Hollywood of this sort of love-hate variety that was very, very fashionable in the 1960s. When the films came out, of course, he had a terrible critical bashing. I mean, most people said these were too brutal. They were airsat American Westerns, you know, that who wants to see a bad American Western? Because when the films first came out, in order to persuade filmgoers that they were American Westerns, everyone hid under pseudonyms. So the early posters for Per un pugno di dollari says Clint Eastwood, John Wells, who is Gian Maria Volonté, Dan Savio, who, I don't know why, is Ennio Morricone, directed by Bob Robertson, which is, and his father was called Roberto Roberti, so it was Bob, son of Robert, and it was a reference to his father. So that in particularly southern Italy, these films, maybe for a moment, you look at the poster and you think it's an American Western, so you go and see it. Of course, by the time of For a Few Dollars More, they were proudly displaying their Italian names and saying these are Italian movies. Alberto Grimaldi presents, you know, etc. So I think they are best. And at last, I think, Leone is moving from that world of sort of cult, popular Italian filmmaking, where you're sort of ghettoized into good, bad movies, yeah? Into another realm, I think. This autumn, we're doing an exhibition devoted to Sergio Leone in Torino, called C'era una volta in Italia. And it's the biggest exhibition in Italy ever devoted to Sergio Leone, and we're having the firearms, which we've managed to find. You've got to have guns with Leone. Costumes, designs of Carlo Simi, the scripts, lots of extracts, lots of artifacts, and also a lot of the publicity for these films. And I think it's a kind of historic moment. It's taking Leone from one world into another. You know? I mean, this is the follow-up to an exhibition about Scorsese. Because another part of this story is the extraordinary reputation that Leone developed in America. That whole generation of filmmakers of the 70s, Scorsese, Milius, Carpenter, Coppola, even Spielberg, had a huge admiration for Once Upon a Time in the West. And in fact, you know, it finds its way in John Carpenter's film, Assault on Precinct 13. One of the characters actually says, that character's got something inside, something to do with death, which is a direct quotation from Once Upon a Time in the West. And then Tarantino and Rodriguez and today's filmmakers. So it was only in Italy that Leone was a prophet without honour, in a way. Now, some critics fought for him, notably Dario Argento. When Argento was a young critic on Paese Sera, he wrote some wonderful reviews of Leone. And indeed Moravia, in his articles in Espresso, at least encouraged us to take the film seriously. But on the whole, the consensus was, these are pretty bad movies. They're rough, they're brutal, they're of no intellectual interest. But in America, that was completely different. So I like to think that we're bringing Leone back home with this exhibition and treating him with the seriousness that he deserves. And there's a book about Alberto Grimaldi that came out, the producer, came out last year, where they had a cinema d'autore, film of authors, and others. And of course Leone is in others. And I'd like to think he should be put up there in the film of authors. If ever you want an author, these films are so distinctive. I mean, you can tell them from 100 yards away that it's a Leone film. It's certainly a vision, whether you like it or not. Final point, I think it's wonderful that the restorations are happening. They're extraordinary. I mean, the new print of Per un pugno is a revelation, actually, not least because it puts back a lot of material that was cut by the censor in England and America. A lot of the brutality, for example, in that scene of the fire, there's lots of little moments with people catching fire and things that we haven't seen before. I mean, it shouldn't worry us, but anyway, it does. But I think it's nice they're doing it, because if you look at the beginning of Kill Bill, Tarantino, to create the atmosphere of popular movies of the 1960s, has an incredibly degraded image with scratches all over it. Run, Run, Shaw presents, you know, it's all scratched and it's going like this, because that's what you expect movies to look like when you see them at drive-ins or at grindhouse cinemas. I think it's absolutely wonderful that they're being taken out of the grindhouse and, you know, onto the big screen again with these restorations. Now, I was going to finish with a treat. Can we do it with the? No, okay. I think you'll have to wait till tomorrow night at 5 o'clock in the Arlecchino. The rushes for A Fistful of Dollars have turned up, and they're absolutely amazing. If you want to see your favourite superhero dropping his gun, getting his lines wrong, trying to make his poncho go like this, and then whoosh, the wind blows it back again all the time. Or Gian Maria Volonte trying to keep a straight face, where Leone is obviously saying, scowl, scowl, and then he completely collapses in laughter. It's absolutely marvellous to watch. All these sort of iconic characters in informal moments. And there's Leone, dressed in a poncho and a cowboy hat and glasses, rushing around, rearranging all their costumes and making sure that everything looks all right. Every single detail he was completely obsessed with, and with the clapperboard. On the rushes, the film was originally called Re il Magnifico, Re the Magnificent, because the central character on the script is called Re. Then it was called Il Magnifico Straniero, the Magnificent Stranger. So for the location shots, the clapperboard has Re the Magnificent on it. For the interiors, which was shot subsequently, it becomes Magnifico Straniero. And then, after it was finished, Unidis, the publicist, wanted to call it Sfida a Texas City, duel in Texas City. And only at the very last minute did they decide to change the title to Per un pugno di dollari. And it's an interesting speculation about whether, if it had been called Ray the Magnificent, whether we'd be watching it today, because titles matter, and it's a terrible title. You know, Ray. Sputafuoco Joe was another title of the script. So they couldn't make up their mind what to call it, and I think the title of Rio Bravo in Italy was Dollari d'Onore, and it may be a reference. The dollar thing may have given the idea because Leone loved Rio Bravo. This is a possible reference. Anyway, tomorrow night I think they're going to show a sort of 3 minutes of the greatest hits of these. There's about 3 hours, I think. And it is a little bit like watching paint dry, but to us Leone buffs, every second counts. But they're going to show a cut-down version of the rushes and this beautiful print of A Fistful of Dollars. Thank you very much.